I'm Patrick Clark. Welcome to Presidential Libraries, Museums, and more. It's time to start our presidential tour. If you think the 2016 election is fraught with mudslinging and muckraking, well, you need to travel back to the second election of the United States of America. That's when the first boss, George Washington, left office. And to be the second president of the U.S., well, you have to go through the first family and on to Quincy, Massachusetts to meet John Adams. If the walls of this home in Quincy, Massachusetts could talk, they'd have a lot of secrets of U.S. history.
We are at the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts, home to 4 generations of the Adams family, most notably John Adams, our second president of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, our 6th president of the United States.
Their house is a museum where people come to see them. 4 generations of the Adams family lived here, each one adding another room or wing over time.
John Adams, when he was thinking of a name to commemorate this house, he admired the peace and tranquility it offered both he and Abigail in their retirement years, and also he wanted to commemorate the Paris Peace Treaty that he had just helped to negotiate. So it was called the estate itself, Peacefield.
Just down the road a few miles is the house where Adams was born, October 30th, 1735. He would become a teacher, a farmer, and a lawyer long before becoming president. In 1764, he married his bride, Abigail Smith.
And she and John moved in here in September of 1788. This is where they would spend the rest of their years in life. We are currently on what was then the Old Coast Road, and that was the main highway between Boston and Plymouth. It was like the superhighway of the 18th century.
His public service in government and as a foreign diplomat led to he and Abigail being apart for almost 10 years. They would write thousands of letters to one another in that time.
What makes this clock unique is it was a gift to John and Abigail upon their wedding. We're hearing the same sound that Abigail would have heard as she's writing to her husband, who's away 300 miles away in Philadelphia or 3,000 miles away in Europe, and she's experiencing, as she described, the great distance between us.
In the election of 1796, Adams would defeat Thomas Jefferson. John and Abigail Adams would be the first family to occupy the unfinished White House. Remember we told you how the Adams family kept adding rooms in their home?
So she did it in the year 1800, unbeknownst to John Adams. She also built a second story to it, and that's right above where we are now. She wanted a place where they could entertain their guests, but also where John Adams could entertain his mind.
Years later, an important part of U.S. history was constructed here in 1870.
Right now we're in the Stone Library, which we consider informally as the first presidential library. It is not with the National Archives, but it is the first presidential library reflecting the books of John Adams and John Quincy Adams.
Here you'll find 12,000 books. As a young lawyer, Adams wanted to amass one of the finest law libraries in the colony of Massachusetts.
Whenever I'm in here, I reflect back on the words of John Adams. He would once write, "Mausoleums, statues, and monuments will never be erected for me." He wasn't feeling very well appreciated, but I would argue that this library is a monument.
As he was getting on in life, his son John Quincy Adams wanted a picture of his dad in his later years and had this painting commissioned.
His comment on it was, "It seems to me to have been awfully wicked to have left such a wife and such a family as I did, but I did so in the service of my country."
Just a short drive down the road, you'll find the final resting place of John and Abigail Adams at the United First Parish Church. In the solitude of the space, you might be reminded of the words of the second U.S. president, who said, "Always stand on principle, even if you stand alone." Did you know he was the principal author of the oldest written constitution still in use in the world? He was the first president to live in the White House, and he wanted to be addressed as His Highness. Up next, we'll hang with Herbert and a guy who loved a Brooks Brothers suit, Abe Lincoln, when Presidential Libraries, Museums, and More returns. The old adage, teach a man to fish and you'll feed him for life, comes to mind with this next Midwestern president. He helped feed the world and made his way up through the depths of an underground mine all the way to the White House. We're in the Hawkeye State to meet our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. If a museum is meant to make you think, then there's a line that runs through the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum that might make you take notice. A fishing line, that is.
When people come here and they see his accomplishments both before and after the presidency, they realized that this was no ordinary individual.
In West Branch, Iowa, on the eastern side of the state, you'll find the first home and final resting place of the 31st President, Herbert Clark Hoover. Upon entering the museum, if you look down, you'll get a sense of the global impact from the humble Hoover.
Hoover believes he fed more than 1.4 billion, with a B, people in the course of those food efforts.
Orphaned by the age of 9, he spent his time in the great outdoors, where he found solace under the sun, an interest in engineering, and his future bride, Lou Henry.
This is a life mask. It's not a death mask. Everyone thinks when they see these plaster casts that it's a death mask. It's a life mask of Hoover taken around 1920.
Hoover's name became anonyms and synonyms for everything right and later wrong in the world. He was the Secretary of Commerce who set the standards still used today in highways, bricks, lumber, and dairy.
He got them to agree to use uniform sizes of pint, quart, half-gallon, gallon.
And the pacifist pair of Herbert and his wife had an interesting side to their travels.
Bert and Lou loved murder mysteries.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so they'd have the latest murder mysteries on the shelf for the guests.
When elected, the 31st president from West Branch was wildly popular. But unbeknownst to him and most Americans, the Great Depression was starting to set in. Hoover would put projects in motion, but the time before results could be seen was too little too late for many. And instead of a second term, FDR was elected to office. Throughout his life, he and Lou Henry spent time in the streams and rivers around the world.
Fishing was kind of just that perfect exercise to be at one, with nature.
And like every good fish story, there's a second act. And how Hoover spent his many years after the Oval Office, well, you might just have to see it for yourself.
What was important to both of them was that people realized their own potential and used that to help others.
This next man made his living as a lawyer, but it was his height and his hat that caught many people's eyes. And the words that came out of this former postmaster's mouth, well, they gained him many a friend and foe. We're in the prairie state of Illinois to learn about our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln. Across the street from Abe's Old Hat Antiques is where you'll find Abe's Old Hat, inside the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. He's our 16th U.S. president, who carved out his place in history starting in Kentucky.
Abraham Lincoln's family moved from Kentucky to Indiana in 1816 when Abraham was about 7 years old.
In this recreated small log cabin, pay attention to the details like this white snake root, the plant that poisoned Lincoln's mother. Inside, you'll find Honest Abe taking a learning by the firelight.
Look carefully, you can see almost all of the 8 people who lived in here. With his hand hanging down there, if you look closely for it, that's probably Abraham's stepbrother John.
Expect a lot of surprises at this presidential museum and library that began as a concept in 1990 and came to completion in 2004. There are plenty of stops on your Central Illinois tour of Lincoln history, like New Salem, where he honed his ideas of what he wanted to do with his life.
Lincoln taught himself the law by reading borrowed books, just as he had taught himself math and trigonometry, more or less, for land surveying.
Keep your eyes open for Mary's music box. It sits on display near Mr. Lincoln's hat. 2 markings on the brim are the worn reminders of this wearied man. Lincoln would often tip his hat as a sign of respect, and the band inside stretched from all the letters and notes this long-framed man kept up top.
Lincoln is the most written about person in the English language after Jesus and probably Shakespeare. He is our only president who held a scientific patent, a device for buoying vessels over shoals.
As students from Notre Dame Academy take in the faux White House, they're joined by the first family out front, and today's lesson on the Emancipation Proclamation. Some experts believe Lincoln was ambidextrous, and despite growing popularity through the years, in his day, Abe wasn't so well liked. He was elected from a field of 4 in 1860 with only 39% of the vote. And if sticks and stones can break your bones, then an ink pen can wield a pretty hefty blow in this political cartoon cavalcade.
Everything's a little askew here, just like the cartoonist's world.
But the real-world problems Lincoln faced were monumental for any man or woman. His second term came to a premature ending with his assassination, April 15, 1865. He was only 56. Just a few miles away from the library and museum, you'll find Oak Ridge Cemetery and Lincoln's tomb. Some say it's good luck to rub Abraham's nose on this bronze bust before entering and paying respect.
We remember Abraham Lincoln for saving the Union and for ending slavery.
He helped hold the country together and made his mark.
And that's the American story, isn't it? He knew that he could rise in life by a little bit of luck, maybe, but mostly by hard work.
Did you know he was the first major leader in the U.S. to feel that women should be allowed to vote? He kept all his important documents inside his hat, and he was a licensed bartender. Up next, we're wild about Harry S. Truman when Presidential Libraries, Museums, and More returns. He started his career working in a haberdashery, sizing up customers who walked through the door, selling them hats for their heads. Later, he became the head man in charge when his boss died unexpectedly. We're in the Show Me State, heading to Independence, Missouri to meet a man named Harry S. Truman, our 33rd president. In Independence, Missouri, on the outskirts of Kansas City, sits the Harry S. Truman Presidential Museum and Library. Keep in mind, Missouri's only president had a hand in this building getting off the ground.
It's the first library that functioned for a post-president.
Dedicated in 1957, Truman raised the money and oversaw the completion of this complex.
And Truman envisioned this library as a place to study the American presidency. He had to make some very, very difficult decisions in his presidency, and he did so without looking back. He made his decisions and he moved on.
That's the chair he sat in during his time in the Oval Office from 1945 to 1953.
The White House itself was undergoing a major renovation, the interior of the White House, but the West Wing, the executive offices were available. So he and Bess lived across the street in Blair House, and then he came to work every morning to the Oval Office.
Like the S that sits in the middle of Superman's chest, this average man's S in the middle of his name was short for nothing. His parents couldn't come to an agreement, so they stuck with S period. And though he wasn't college educated, this true man was well read.
Was, as informed as any professor of the day on those issues. He loved history, he read the Bible, he read Shakespeare, he knew ancient history, he knew American history very well, and I think had a sense of what it meant to be a part of history.
The man who made a global impact also liked to collect them.
This was a gift from General Eisenhower that had been in his office in Frankfurt. Truman was very proud of that.
Truman faced a world war, a post-war, a Cold War, Korea, the formation of Israel, and the restructuring of the executive office. He was the man responsible for the decision to drop the atomic bomb and understood the weight of his actions, as evidenced by this Purple Heart and letter from a grieving father.
I think war was a very real thing for Harry Truman. And so to get a scathing letter like that from the parent of someone who had died in Korea was not something he could sort of toss off as, well, that's just one of the decisions you have to make in leadership. I think he obviously felt it very deeply, and he kept that Purple Heart and that letter in his desk. It was found after he died.
In the recreated West Wing, high school students get a taste of the top office in the world.
He was much more interested in young people in particular having an opportunity to study the office of the presidency and what that meant for democracy going forward.
From love letters to his bride Bess to his restored Chrysler, you'll find a lot of the president's personal touches in this Independence home.
Yeah, on a daily basis, he worked here sometimes 6 days a week. In fact, when no other staff was around, he answered the phone. People would call to find out what the hours were, and it would be Harry Truman that would pick up the phone on some occasions.
And if you're wild about Harry and want to take a walk in his footsteps, you'll see the desk he kept there after leaving the Oval Office.
He was sort of an original Missourian in that way, had a kind of stubborn streak, as he liked to sort of refer to, but did it with a kind of grace and elegance and class, and I think is appropriately remembered for that.
The library he loved is also the final resting place for Harry, his wife Bess, and daughter Margaret.
I think there are a lot of things about him that gave him a kind of common touch, but I don't think there's anything at all common about Harry Truman. I think he was an extraordinary individual.
And as Harry himself often said, that's all there was to it. Did you know his middle name S serves as a tribute to his relatives whose names began with that letter? His poor eyesight kept him from attending West Point, so he enlisted in the National Guard, and Harry Truman served as an artillery commander during World War I. Up next, Benjamin Harrison has a sound system you'll have to hear when Presidential Libraries, Museums, and More returns. If you want to get anything done in life, you have to do it yourself. That might have been the mantra of our next gentleman, for in 1861 he formed his own regiment and later became a Civil War general. Let's make our way to the Hoosier State for our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. It's been said if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. And where Benjamin Harrison stood, well, he had a pretty good view of downtown Indianapolis.
There are over 350,000 bricks that make up the house. It's built on a solid limestone foundation. He actually built the house with his first wife, Caroline, in 1874, and they moved into this house in 1875.
Harrison took a stand on many issues. Though at 5'6", he was our second shortest president. But in Indianapolis, Indiana, the state capital, Ben Harrison still casts a long shadow. And at his presidential site, it's his library where you'll find some of the more unusual items that occupied the Oval Office.
The Longhorn armchair that is probably the finest piece of presidential bling that you could find. This bookcase here behind me, and this was actually in payment for a legal debt. He actually won a case for a German cabinet maker, an immigration case, and this is apparently how German cabinet makers show their gratitude.
You'll see Harrison's 19th century sound system and the cane carved to commemorate the first 23 presidents, including the misspelled James Manderson. In fact, there's many canes and walking sticks that Harrison carried around as a lawyer, a brigadier general in the Civil War, and later as president.
And we actually have that original commission that was signed by Abraham Lincoln with his full name, making Harrison brigadier general.
If that doesn't make one snap to attention, then keep your eyes open for Harrison's Bible, used during his oath of office, and his handwritten note letting you know where he placed his palm. When elected, Harrison was the centennial president, celebrating 100 years since George Washington took the very first oath.
So his great-grandfather was Benjamin Harrison V, who was governor of Virginia and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His grandfather was William Henry Harrison, who was 9th president of the United States.
Tariffs might have taken their toll on his presidency, but the loss of his wife Caroline took the wind out of his sails. Her influence is everywhere, from the pianos she played to the dinnerware she designed.
It's very well made. It's not ostentatious. It'd be a fine example of a house of its time. So it's about 10,000 square feet in all. In Indiana, we take the word Hoosier with great pride. I know there are other places where Hoosier is maybe not the nicest thing to call somebody, but he was a Hoosier in the truest sense.
Harrison was our neighbor, kind and good, our common friend and fellow citizen. Did you know he was the first president to use electricity in the White House? He was the first president to have his voice preserved, and Benjamin Harrison was the first and only president from Indiana. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us on our presidential tour. I'm Patrick Clark. We'll see you next time.